Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests and friends, good afternoon. And first of all, I thank you all for braving the Delhi heat and the Delhi traffic to be here. I'm grateful. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for presiding over this session. I feel honored. And Mr. Vice Chair, thank you, of course, for introducing this distinguished lecture series and doing me the singular honor of inviting me to deliver this inaugural lecture. And now I'll switch to calling you Indu. Indu, thank you for your very generous introduction and exaggerated, but still, I'm naturally thrilled. And more importantly, I'm not sure if I should thank you or not, but still, for setting me up with an impossible task of living up to your expectations. Ms. Vasudevan, Asia's distinguished member of the board, I highly appreciate that you traveled all the way from Bangalore to be here with us today. Thank you. And finally, my most sincere thanks to Team Asia, led by Neeti and Abhilasha, for your great work in putting all this together. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I want to start with talking about a puzzle, and a puzzle that I think Indu has very well summarized, something that he and I, I'm sure all of you, have ruminated on. And to do that, I want to take you back in history a bit. Think of Rome, 133 BC. The city is tense. For weeks, political conflicts has been building around a proposal on the surface which seems very straightforward. A land reform program intended to redistribute public land to poorer citizens. Its sponsor is a young tribune, elected magistrate, Tiberius Gracchus, ambitious, eloquent, and convinced that the republic must act to address the growing inequality. The proposal was disruptive, but not unlawful, but it threatened aristocratic interests. The Roman Republic at that time had no single written constitution. Its order rested less on formal design than on shared restraint. It rested on distributed magistracies. The annual rotation, magistrates or the tribunes were elected for a year each, collegial offices, and a deeply embedded norm of what they call mos maiorum, meaning the way of the ancestors. Senators could deliberate, that's the upper house. The assembly could vote, but only any of the 10 tribunes that I mentioned could veto. A fellow tribune, Marcus Octavius, did just that. He blocked the land reform proposal. But Tiberius refuses to accept that veto. So what does he do? He takes the extraordinary step of appealing directly to the assembly and has Octavius removed from office. A move not clearly illegal, but deeply against established practice. A line has been crossed, the measure passes, the conflict, however, deepens. Months later, the stakes rise again. This time, Tiberius is seeking re-election to the tribunate. It's a one-year term. People usually never stood for re-election. But again, not illegal, but another break from the norm of mos maiorum. His opponents now see him not just as a reformer, but a man who might be trying to accumulate power in ways that threaten the balance of the republic. On the day of the vote, A huge crowd gathers on the Capitolian Hill where the assembly meets. The atmosphere is charged, and rumors spread that Tiberius is reaching for the crown, that he aspires perhaps to kingship, and a word which still carries deep fear in Rome. Inside the Senate, the upper house, which is meeting a bit further away, the mood turns from opposition to alarm. One of the senior senators, Scipio Nasicaris, rises and calls for action. There is no formal decree, no legal process. Instead, he wraps part of his toga around his head as if for sacrifice and urges those present to follow him to save the republic. A group of senators and their supporters move quickly out of the Senate House. They do not carry swords. They pick up whatever is at hand, broken benches, wooden clubs, sticks. They advance towards the assembly hall where Tiberius stands with his supporters. The crowd parts and then surges, and in the confusion, blows are struck. Tiberius is hit and then struck again. He falls. Others fall with him. The violence is sudden, chaotic, and concentrated. Within moments, a tribune of the republic is dead, killed not by an invading force, not in war, but by members of his own political order. His body, along with those of many of his followers, is gathered up and thrown into the river Tiber. Nothing in the formal structure of the republic has been abolished. The Senate still sits, the assembly still functions, magistrates will still be elected. And yet, something fundamental has changed. Political violence in this form had no accepted place so far in the life of the republic. Conflict had always existed, often intense, but it had been mediated through institutions. What happened that day marked not simply an escalation, but a breach of a boundary that had long defined the system. However, even more important is how that breach is understood. It is not taken as a systemic rupture. It is explained as an emergency, as a response to provocation, as an act taken to preserve the republic itself. Because it is framed as exceptional, it does not immediately transform the system. It is absorbed, but it alters expectations. The republic continues, but it continues differently. And that, I think, is the central puzzle we face. Why do institutions that appear stable, sometimes deeply entrenched and long enduring, begin to weaken? Why do systems that function effectively for long periods of time gradually lose their coherence? Our instinct is to look for decisive causes, crises, shocks, revolutions. These happen sometimes, and they often matter, but history suggests that by the time such moments occur, the underlying process of weakening is already well advanced, a point that Indu very rightly alludes to in his introduction. Institutions rarely fail at the moment they appear to break. They fail after a process that has already unfolded reaches a tipping point. Institutions are sustained not only by formal rules, but by expectations, by a shared belief that rules will broadly hold, that limits will be observed, and that others will behave within an accepted framework. As long as those expectations remain aligned, institutions appear stable. When they begin to shift, the system does not collapse, it adjusts. Actors respond to what they perceive others are doing. They test boundaries, often cautiously at first, then more openly. They justify deviations as necessary, temporary, or pragmatic. And because each step appears limited, it is absorbed. Over time, what was once exceptional becomes arguable. What was arguable becomes acceptable. And what becomes acceptable gradually becomes normal. That is how institutional changes take hold, not through a simple single rupture, but through a process of normalization. And that is exactly why decline of institutions is also so often misread. We mistake persistence for strength. We assume that institutions still function, therefore they are intact. But history suggests that institutional weakening is often a process of internal misalignment, one that unfolds within continuity rather than against it. Collapse, if you like to think of it, collapse is the epilogue. Unmaking is the story. And the purpose of this lecture is to understand that story, how institutions hold, how they come apart, and what history reveals about that process. So let me begin briefly then with how institutions hold together. The conditions of stability. What sustains those boundaries in the first place? Why is it that for long periods institutions appear to function with a degree of stability? Rules are followed, disputes are contained, and outcomes, even when contested, remain broadly acceptable. The answer lies, I believe, not in the formal design of institutions alone, but in a set of underlying conditions that allow institutions to operate as intended. These conditions are rarely written in any one single document. Constitutions, yes, laws, yes, but they are much more because they're embedded in practice, reinforced over time, and sustained through shared expectations of mutual respect, of mutual behavior, and accepting checks and balances. I suggest that there are essentially 5 pillars which hold up institutions in a society. Number 1, legitimacy. Institutions endure when they're broadly accepted as appropriate by those who operate within them and by those subject to them, who believe that the rules are worth following. Definitely does not mean that everybody agrees with every every outcome, but it implies a willingness to accept outcomes within a common framework. Without that acceptance, institutions must increasingly rely on coercion, and their ability to function smoothly diminishes. Second, restraint. All institutional systems concentrate power in some form. Their stability depends not only on how that power is distributed, on checks and balances, but on also how it is exercised. When those who hold power accept limits, often unwritten limits, institutions remain balanced. When those limits are tested repeatedly, even within informal rules, the system begins to shift. Restraint in this sense is not a constraint imposed from outside. It is a discipline and a concept of mutual respect maintained from within. Third, capacity. Institutions must be able to do what they claim to do. Decisions must be made and implemented, rules enforced, and outcomes delivered with a reasonable degree of consistency. When this capacity weakens, whether through administrative inefficiency, resource constraints, institutional fatigue, or intentionally engineered, the credibility of the system begins to erode. Performance and belief, in this sense, are closely connected. Fourth, norms. These are the unwritten expectations that guide behavior when formal rules are incomplete or silent. The concept of mos maiorum. They define what is socially acceptable, what is excessive, and what lies beyond the bounds of institutional conduct. They make it possible for systems to function without having to codify every contingency. They are what social scientist Cristina Bicchieri has termed the grammar of society, the language a society speaks. When norms are strong, institution absorbs stress without destabilizing. When they weaken, the burden on formal rules increases and often proves insufficient. And fifth and finally, the capacity to adapt. No institutional system operates in a static environment. Economic conditions change, social structures evolve, political pressures shift. Institutions must adjust in ways to preserve coherence. Too little adaptation leads to rigidity. Too much or poorly managed change can produce instability. The balance is difficult but essential. What matters most, however, is not how any of these 5 pillars that I mentioned work in isolation, but their alignment. Institutions function as an equilibrium maintained by mutually reinforcing expectations. Legitimacy supports compliance. Restraint sustains norms. Capacity underpins credibility. Adaptation preserves relevance. And together, they create a framework within which actors can anticipate the behavior of others with some confidence. As long as that confidence holds, the system appears stable. But that stability cannot and must not be taken for granted. It depends on the continued alignment of these underlying conditions. When that alignment begins to loosen, even slightly, the system does not immediately fail. It adjusts. And it is in that adjustment, often gradual and barely visible at first, is the process where the institutional decay begins. It is to that process, to how systems move from stability to strain, that I now turn. However, before I talk about these underlying drivers of institutional decline, it is perhaps useful to step back and look at how this process unfolded in practice across different historical settings. I have looked at 5 different societies: the Roman Republic, the Mauryas, the Ming Dynasty, the Weimar Republic, and Argentina in the 20th century. They are separated by centuries, by geography, by political form. And yet, when we look at them together, a pattern begins to emerge. Let us begin with Rome. As we saw, In 133 BC, a political dispute ends in violence. The republic survives, but something fundamental has shifted. Norms that once constrained behavior begin to loosen. Over the next century, those norms erode further until in 49 BC, Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon. The republic does not fall immediately, it transforms gradually into something else. Now consider the Mauryan Empire. Built under Emperor Chandragupta around 322 BC, it reaches its zenith under Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BC. But its strength rests heavily on the center. After Ashoka's death in 232 BC, that center weakens. Coordination thins. Central authority drifts. There is no dramatic collapse. The system simply loses its coherence. By 185 BC, Emperor Brihadratha is killed by his own general in full view of the assembled court and army at a grand parade, drawing down the curtain on the Mauryas. Move forward to Ming China. Founded in 1368 by Emperor Hongwu, it creates one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems of its time. For nearly 2 centuries, it governs effectively. But over time, rigidity sets in, fiscal pressures build, factional conflicts intensify. The system continues to function, but increasingly without responsiveness. Collapse finally comes in 1644, some 275 years later. Emperor Chongzhen takes his own life as rebels are at the gates of Beijing. It appears sudden, but in reality, the system had lost gradually, but surely, its ability to adapt. The Qing dynasty follows. Now consider Weimar Germany. Formed in 1919, it begins with a modern constitution and democratic ambitions. But legitimacy is fragile even from the outset. The punitive burden of reparations following the Treaty of Versailles and economic shocks, hyperinflation 1923, depression after 1929, strain the system. Political fragmentation intensifies and becomes increasingly bitter and xenophobic. By 1930, parliamentary government gives way to rule by decree. All legal, but parliamentary is bypassed and decrees from the chancellor decide the day. Institutions remain, but their substance weakens. When Adolf Hitler is appointed chancellor in 1933, the transition appears abrupt, but the conditions for it had been building for years. And the rest, as they say, is history. And finally, Argentina. At the start of the 20th century, it stands amongst the world's most prosperous economies. But from the 1930s onward, a different pattern emerges, not one of collapse, but of drift. The rise of Perón in 1945 marks a shift in how institutions in the country function. Over the decades that follow, the country moves through cycles of crisis and recovery, coups, inflation, reform, reversal, coups. The system does not break, it endures, it drifts. But its ability to anchor expectations steadily weakens. 5 different beginnings, 5 very different trajectories. Rome stretches over centuries. The Mauryan Empire fragments rather quickly. Ming decays slowly. Weimar collapses within a generation. Argentina does not collapse at all. it drifts. And yet, beneath this wide variation of outcomes, there is a common pattern. In each case, decline, of course, does not begin with the same stress. It begins with norms in Rome, central authority being diminished in the Mauryas, lack of adaptability in the Ming case, lack of legitimacy in Weimar, and unstable expectations in Argentina. From that starting point, pressure spread across the system, and over time, something deeper begins to shift, not just institutions, but behavior itself. That is where the story becomes common. These cases differ widely in time, geography, and institutional form, but each provides a concrete illustration of how systems that appear stable begin to weaken, how that weakening evolves over time. If that is the pattern, the obvious question is, what are the forces that drive this process? I have identified 5 such forces, call them drivers of decay, and to them I now turn. The drivers of decay. The first is elite fragmentation. Institutions depend on a minimum level of coordination among those who operate them, where elites share a common framework. Even amid disagreement, competition remains bounded. When that framework weakens, coordination becomes more difficult. Trust declines. Political and institutional competition become less bounded. Actors become less willing to accept short-term losses within a stable system and more inclined to secure immediate advantage, even at the cost of weakening the system itself. In Rome, this is visible in the growing inability of political actors to accept limits within the system. The Tiberius episode marks an early point at which disagreement begins to move beyond accepted boundaries. Over time, this fragmentation deepens, making cooperation increasingly difficult. In the Mauryan case, fragmentation takes a different form. It is not expressed through overt conflict, but the weakening of central authority. As the coherence of the center diminishes, the system loses its ability to coordinate effectively across regions. In both cases, the form differs, but the effect is the same. The system's coordinating core begins to falter. Second, institutional capture. As coordination weakens, institutions begin to be used more transactionally. They are not dismantled, they are in place, but their operations shifts from general rules-based functioning to more particularistic use. This shift does not appear, to begin with, very dramatic. Rules are not necessarily abandoned, they are reinterpreted, bent, or selectively applied. It often takes place through incremental adjustments, sometimes even difficult to perceive. Appointments, procedural changes, selective enforcement. Each step taken in isolation may even seem defensible, but over time, these changes alter the functioning of the system itself. The effect is cumulative. In the later Roman Republic, institutions such as assemblies and magistracies increasingly become arenas for political maneuvering rather than neutral mechanisms of governance. The pattern appears as selective enforcement, politicized appointments, or uneven application of rules. Third, erosion of norms and legitimacy. Norms define acceptable behavior. legitimacy sustains voluntary compliance. When norms weaken, behavior begins to expand into areas that were previously constrained. When legitimacy declines, compliance becomes increasingly conditional. In Rome, early norm violations do not destroy the republic, they alter the baseline. In Weimar, constitutional provisions designed for exceptional use are invoked with increasing frequency, gradually changing the character of governance itself. Fourth, administrative and fiscal delay. As I said earlier, institution must deliver. And when this capacity weakens, the credibility of the system itself begins to erode. Ming China illustrates this particularly well. The administrative apparatus remains extensive, but over time, effectiveness declines. Fiscal constraints limit capacity. Bureaucratic rigidity reduces flexibility. And fifth and finally, external or structural shocks. Economic crisis, wars, environmental stress, and technological changes can place sudden pressure on institutions. These shocks, however, do not by themselves determine outcomes. What matters is how institutions respond to them. Where underlying conditions remain strong, systems can absorb shocks and adapt. Where they've already weakened, shocks tend to exacerbate decline. They expose underlying vulnerabilities and intensifying existing pressures, pushing system closer to critical thresholds. These shocks vary in form, but their significance lie in how they interact with existing weaknesses. In Weimar Germany, economic crisis intensify already fragile legitimacy and deepen political fragmentation. In Argentina, repeated shocks interact with weak institutional foundations to produce cycles of instability. Taken together, I believe these 5 drivers provide a way of understanding of how institutional decline unfolds. These drivers do not have the same impact in each case. They do not have equal weight. This depends on the circumstances. But in any case, their importance lies not in their individual presence, but it lies in the interactions of these 5 drivers. They form a system. And once that system begins to falter, decline tends to spread across institutional dimensions. Expectations shift. Actors no longer assume that rules will broadly hold or that commitments will be reliably honored. Decisions become more defensive, more opportunistic, and less anchored in shared institutional expectations. These adjustments might appear, and sometimes are, individually rational. Each actor is responding to perceived uncertainty in the behavior of others. But collectively, they produce a new dynamic. Institutionally, weakening begins to generate behavior that reinforces it. That is the logic of the downward spiral. The historical cases that I have discussed illustrate this dynamic with striking consistency, even as they differ in form and space. What makes this process of downward spiral particularly powerful that it is largely endogenous. It arises from within the system rather than being imposed from outside. External shocks may accelerate it, but they do not create it. The spiral is sustained by the interaction between expectations and behavior. The downward spiral, as I've just mentioned, explains how institutional decline becomes self-reinforcing. But it also helps clarify something that is often misunderstood. Decline does not lead to a single predictable outcome. The ultimate end point of the decline need not always be a collapse. It may also lead to transformation, fragmentation, failure, capture, or persistent underperformance, as we saw and see in the case of Argentina. The specific outcomes depends on how the underlying drivers interact with the structure of the system and the choices made by those who operate it. There is another very important and interesting common pattern in the 5 countries we've discussed so far. In each case, if you think of it, there were periods when corrective actions might still have been possible. These were not moments of acute crisis yet, and it was periods in which the system still retained sufficient coherence for reforms to be effective. In Rome, there were opportunities to restore norms of restraint before conflict escalated further. A more institutionalized and stable succession process in the Mauryan Empire might have preserved central coherence before authority began to thin. Administrative reforms in Ming China might have strengthened their adaptive capacity before the pressures became overwhelming. In Weimar Germany, periods of relative stabilization offered space to rebuild legitimacy and coordination. In Argentina, repeated moments of partial recovery created openings for deeper institutional consolidation. These were, in a sense, what I call the lost moments. They did not necessarily pass unnoticed. Reform efforts were often attempted, but they were neither sustained nor sufficiently embedded, or were overtaken by the dynamics of the downward spiral. Policy changes alone proved insufficient. What was required was a deeper realignment of expectations, of behavior, and institutional function, and that proved much more difficult to achieve. Let me now draw the various threads together by offering 2 observations. One, institutions are shaped or reshaped gradually as the conditions that sustain them begin to shift. Individual responses to a shift may appear rational, but collectively, Saint's rational fool's concept begins to take hold. What might be rational for an individual could be irrational for the system as a whole. The quiet unmaking begins, and at some point down the line, the decline is no longer episodic. It becomes self-reinforcing. Collapse or some other transformation ultimately follows. But each case also offers us some hope, and that is my second and final observation. Each indicates, as I said, that there were lost moments which need not have been lost. These moments arise during the period before the collapse, the quieter period in which institutions still continue to function, though they have begun to fray. And it is that quieter period where perhaps, just perhaps, some actions could have been taken. And who knows, history might have been different. Thank you.